We're here to help you navigate your business growth with strategic conversations and insights from experts in multiple industries. Welcome to Wayfinding Growth.
This episode of Wayfinding Growth is brought to you by Sprocket Talk. If you're ready to take your HubSpot experience to a whole new level, you need to join Sprocket Talk as a free VIP member. That's right, free. Tutorials, courses, training, HubSpot updates, and so much more. Head to sprockettalk.com/WG to join the movement and get an exclusive Wayfinding Growth deal.
Welcome to the show. I'm Remington Begg.
Hey, and I'm Dan Moyle. So glad you're here. I'm excited today because on today's episode, Remington, as you know, we're diving into the Impulse creative journey. I love that we do these every other week is like outside, inside, outside, side. I hope listeners, you're enjoying it. Because today's subject we're talking about is culture. So Remington, what did you love about talking this through on this episode? What did you come away with?
Yeah, so it felt like there were multiple layers of an onion that you were unpeeling as we were going through it.
Yes, totally.
But one of the things that stuck out to me, and almost like a self-reflection or like that like light bulb moment for me while I was even talking about it, was that as a leader, we have to be focused on inspiring a culture versus building it, right? So the first time I tried to do it, it crashed, and it was because I was focused on building one. But the difference in that inspiring the culture and what that's done for Impulse.
Yep. And it's cool to see that come out, of our discussion and hopefully inspire those others who are going through that, owners and leaders, executives, whatever. Like, you can't control it, but you can inspire it. I like that. So I got out of it, I love what you said about how ownership as part of culture and what that means for employees and team members. What does ownership mean? So listen for that, listeners. And then the other one was you talked about hiring somebody as like marriage. And I was like, what does that mean? And then what you said blew my mind, because I talk about this in marriage stuff with my wife and everything. Like, you can't change someone. You can't get married and think you're going to change them. Right. And that blew my mind. So listen for that, folks. Dude, great discussion. All right.
Thanks.
Listeners, here we are, season 2, episode 7. Let's set a course for growth. All right, Remington, here we are talking about culture, talking about Wayfinding Growth. Man, I'm excited. Welcome back.
Yeah.
So I want to dive into culture. We've talked about this a little bit when it comes to hybrid teams, especially remote plus in-house plus whatever else we're doing today in this day's world, right? But let's center it first.
Sure.
What does culture mean to you as the co-founder and CEO?
So when I think about culture, I think about it very similar to how I feel about brand. Mm-hmm. Right? Brand is like the image that that people have of your company. Culture is almost like the image that your team has, or that your team can like unite upon inside the org. So like, if you looked at, behind the mirror, if you will, like, I feel like everything behind the mirror is brand, but everything's reflecting back at you is culture. And I think they're very well intertwined.
Mm-hmm. So is culture kind of like the inside of the company brand?
Well, I think it ties in. I mean, you've got to have something you stand for as an org, right? And the people should be aligned with that. But I don't think it's something that a company can define. I think it's defined by choices, not defined by definition. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think about some of my experiences with past companies and jobs and stuff. And I think of culture as like, there's a few things there, right? I mean, societies have a culture. That's a big thing, right?
Yep.
So we talk about company culture. On one hand, it's kind of like you roll your eyes and you go, really? Culture? But in reality, it is the interaction between employees, between leaders, all this kind of stuff. It's what people say behind your back. I look at it too as like there's part of culture that comes from the top down and part of it that comes from the inside out.
Right.
And it's hard to balance those things. But I noticed like when culture is bad, you see it. You're like, oh man, that's a bad culture. And I can think back to a particular company. I won't name or anything, but we talked about culture quite a bit there. And like, okay, great. Our core values are these things. Awesome. But we're not living them.
Right.
And like, here's our actual core values. It's like the secret core values. And so when culture goes awry, it's really tough.
Yep.
So yeah, I like that it's kind of like brand, but inside the company. How do we think about culture at Impulse Creative? Like, do you and Rachel, your co-founder, our COO, Do you guys talk about culture? How do you kind of manage that?
So we used to obsess over it.
Mm.
And I think that was, so it kind of ties into what you were saying before with that other company, where they say what it is, but yet it wasn't actually that. So when we first started hiring people, which really was like 2012-ish, we were very, very focused on trying to be like the Google, right?
That's what we all think, is it, right? Like,
Yeah, well,
I want to
and
be Googled.
and Google does a great job of like branding all of that stuff in, but then fast forward a few years, you start to understand how like different personalities fit differently, and how different personalities are needed. Because they're different doesn't mean that it's not needed, right? Just like, but you just have to understand how certain personalities jive. And the big thing that we focus on now is, like, I say ownership, but I want to inspire ownership of the problem, ownership of trying to figure out the solution. And that's like that's the area where I try to kind of inspire in that regard. We do have core values. And it's funny because as an owner, I have to temper myself because I always want to blow them up. But we've had conversations, and our core values have changed a little bit as we go. But what's been interesting when we think about culture specifically is, the first round, we'll put it, we were talking about, kegerators and beer and bean bags and, a nice welcoming open air office and all these things. Now we have all of those things still, but when we bought them and when we did that stuff years ago, the reason was for culture, while now we're doing things to make people more comfortable, right? So because we've realized that the culture is just like the sum of all parts, almost, if you will. And we noticed when we had our chrysalis effect that we referenced a couple episodes back, that the culture changed dramatically, right? Because the what we thought the culture would be or should be left with the people that left.
Mm.
And what was cool is we started to see some things blossom and some ideas that we liked. And that was also when we defined these new core values. So yeah, I think it's intentional, if you will, in regards to like the aspirations of trying to have a healthy culture. But I don't know that I have any part nowadays in creating it,
Right.
or a majority stake in creating it, I should put. I think I'm 1/15 of the culture now.
That's fair. That's fair. So that chrysalis effect you were mentioning was when we talked on becoming a distributed team just like 2 episodes ago, how we lost a bunch of our staff and clients and what that meant to you. So listeners, go back and listen to episode 5, I think it was. So
You've got to listen to that episode twice.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, that's really smart.
I love those discussions. So before 2012, you said when you were hiring, was it just you? Was it the Remington show? Was it freelancers? Like, what changed in 2012 that we began to hire? What was that growth point for us?
So it was Rachel. Well, it was originally me for like 8 months, and then it was Rachel and me. That was from 2008 to 2012. So the economy wasn't the best back then. We didn't, to be honest, know enough about business to even think that we deserved to hire someone back then. But once we realized that, hey, like we got something here, we can start to scale. The answer was, okay, we can't pull any more, 12 to 12s. And what I mean by that is like midnight to midnights.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And then we needed to kind of scale up. And so that was the big pivot. But Rachel was doing a lot of creative. I was doing development and sales. And we decided that we just had to step into the big boy pants.
Interesting that you say you feel like you didn't deserve to hire. I wonder how many owners and entrepreneurs and even just executives like feel that in some way, or I was talking to George earlier, George B. Thomas, one of our teammates, and we were talking about inbound coming up and how fun it's going to be to walk the halls, the three of us, and see who's out there and, this kind of thing. Right. And so like for me in the HubSpot world, I used to be on the HubSpot homepage years ago. I was a case study. I've become known with my success with HubSpot, but I still feel pretty humble about it. And George has become quite a name with all the different things he does. He's still pretty humble. And he was like, dude, own your authority.
Yeah.
It's like, that's good. So I think that kind of goes along with this too, is like own your authority. You felt like you didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
So how many people out there feel that same way? That's interesting.
Well, and with that, I've always thought about hiring, and this is maybe it's my approach, but I've always thought about hiring being like a commitment, almost like marriage, and that's going to scare away like 95% of applicants now. But when we look at that, right, we're walking into this relationship and with an employee, and we can't be like, oh, I want to bring them on so I can change them. Right? Like we have to bring them on as like this person I could live with for the rest of my life. If an employee is hired as a temporary addition, then they should never have been an employee in the first place, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Right? If it's contract, that's a completely different story. That's not, to me, an employee. That's like a contract laborer for a project. Like both sides know it's a temporary thing. So when I say deserve to, like we weren't in the position to hire someone. We were in a point of survival as a company, as a couple, as an individual, before that. And it wasn't until the point where we were like, okay, we can actually cover this payroll forever if we keep doing what we're doing, and this person doesn't deliver anything, right? Like, and then it started to turn into, okay, that worked. Or that didn't work. Like there were quite a lot of that worked and that didn't work, but we always went into it like, I could work with this person for the rest of my career.
Yeah. It's funny because when you say 2007, 2012, I mean, I think, man, that's like so close. That's 7 years ago, man.
Yeah.
Like that's a lifetime for some agencies. So
yeah,
kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of agencies that are, that are upset about the fact that they haven't grown more than 30%. They've only been open 2.5 years. And mm-hmm. I could not imagine starting an agency and growing faster than that. Not having done it before, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's crazy.
So speaking of growth and being wayfinding growth, how does culture fit into growth? Like if I think of growth, I often think of more sales, more clients. Sure. What does culture mean to growth?
Yeah. So I'm going to add a word in there, the right culture. Mm-hmm. So the right culture allows, Dharmesh talked a couple inbounds ago about vectors, and a talk he had with Elon Musk, and how everyone is all lined on the same vector. And that really hit me hard. That to me is like the elements of just talking about how aligning the vectors, like a good culture is like aligned vectors. So those aligned vectors are a thing that are very much a piece of the right culture that can lead to growth. Having a culture, I think you have a culture even if you don't call it one. You have people who have feelings, who think a certain way, and hopefully those are aligned, right? It could be that they just feel like family, or it could be that they hate each other's guts outside of work, but they come in and they do their duty. Like there's lots of different cultures that I think can lead to growth. But the vectors have to align. Like if the vectors are all over the place, like spaghetti plopped on a plate, then you're just there. So that's just a thought that, a thought I've got in that regard. But when you talk about a good culture, the right culture, and aligning those vectors, I think that really there is no end in the potential for growth, because that's where people start to become smarter, work smarter on things, not harder. And that's also an area where we can focus on how you can start digging in deeper to understanding how we can increase performance and increase outputs without increasing expenditures as an org, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it does help growth if everyone cares and they're all aligned. But again, that spaghetti plop on a plate, it doesn't help anybody.
Right. So you have to, you said earlier that you are 1/15 of the culture.
Yeah.
But in reality, you have to help guide it. You may not create it anymore, but you help guide it, but you can't force it. But getting those vectors aligned, do things like hiring and benefits and communication all come into play when it comes to that, guiding that culture for you as the owner?
Yeah. So sounds incredibly shallow. Those are ways to acquire and retain.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that those are things that drive culture. Like a caring culture in general would probably have those attributes. But I think that when you start thinking about like culture specifically, no, that stuff doesn't matter. I don't think the absence of that would mean you didn't have a culture. You could just be bootstrapped. You know what I mean? But I do think that it signals to the outside that you care about your people or you care about longevity, and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I see our culture is growth oriented. One of our core values that is basically invest in ourselves and our personal and professional development.
Yep.
That's a huge part of our culture, and I feel valued. I said a long time ago to myself, or maybe to my wife or somebody, like, if I feel valued and I have autonomy, I'll do anything, right? Like, I mean, we all need a paycheck. Don't get me wrong, but sure. I feel like being valued and having the autonomy and just cared for, which I guess is valued.
Sure.
I don't care as much about the paycheck. Like, I'm glad I get paid, but
yeah.
But I don't care about that. I don't want to come and say, well, $150,000 a year and blah blah blah. If you pay me $1 million a year, but it's a bad culture, man, I'm out.
Right.
Right.
Well, I think that that's a great point, and I think that if the reason that someone is doing something, like everyone's going to work because they have to, right. But I think that if that's the sole reason for existing at a specific company, like you could go do that elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where culture is a competitive advantage, right? It's the familiarity, it's the relationship, it's that feeling of value you just mentioned. I think those things for sure help with growth, and tie into those things, because it's not profitable to be hiring. It's not profitable to constantly be training people into a new position and for them to leave, right?
Right.
They should be there forever. And that's why it's worth investing in people the right way. But if I only think of it as a 3-month or a 6-month transaction, I'm not going to invest in it the right way as an org, but I'm still 1/15 of that culture, regardless of how much I inspire it, because I can put a whole lot out there. The other 14 in this instance have to pick it up or not. Right. And so that's where, like, I would like to think that I'm more than 1/15 of a piece of the culture pie, but to be completely honest, I've learned that I'm not, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I see a quote every once in a while. I'm like on a LinkedIn meme or somewhere. Somebody asks, well, what if I train my employees better and they leave? And they're like, what if you don't train them and they stay?
Yeah, 100%.
Right? Like, that development is so huge. So I want to get to the question that I want to ask in a minute here, but that I'll tee it up right now, but I want to go back to something before that. I want to talk about culture in a hybrid team, distributed, in-house, this kind of a thing. But before we get there, I want to go back to something you said earlier that'll lead us into it. You talked about everybody wants to be Google.
Yeah.
Right. And I see this. Everybody wants to be Google or Facebook or HubSpot. And we all want the free beer and the beanbag cheers.
Right.
But when you say everybody wants to be Google, what about their culture is so enticing? Is it like that free stuff, or is it something different?
So I think it's success born. Google makes boatloads of money, is usually the pinnacle of most startup stories, isn't going anywhere, right? Heck, they're now Alphabet, right? Like they literally have 26 letters they could create additional Googles of. But when you think about like they landed hard, they have a lot of people, they came out with methodologies early. And when you think about like startups, they're really one of the earlier startups that was actually successful. Like when I think about like the companies in general, like you can look at Facebook and have a similar conversation about culture and everything. They're going through a little bit of a hiccup right now. I'm not sure what their culture means, but like Google's always been very clear from a brand and also from a, you know, and just from an organizational standpoint. And I think that's where that aspiration comes from. And then, you've got like people throwing around hyper growth companies and stuff like that. I think there's connotations that apply to each of those. Hyper growth ones being mostly startups that are trying to turn into $1 billion fund, $1 billion exits. Mm-hmm. But like Google didn't do that to exit, right? Like they're there to like do something and be meaningful. So that's something that I think that's why people throw Google. And then of course, they've got movies about it. Like, was it The Intern or whatever? Like they've got movies of people being able to walk up to the coffee bar and not get charged and stuff like that. And sure, we want to make things comfortable so people stay. Like there is a business transactional reason for that, right? If I offer you lunch for $9, you don't leave for an hour.
Right.
Like you'll stay at the office. Maybe you'll take a half-hour lunch instead of an hour lunch. Now that sandwich just netted me a positive return. There's obviously those like indicators about why they did it, but it's very public and it's quite successful. So everyone wants to be like them. Yeah. It takes you a while to own your own space. Hell, we've been doing it for 12 years and I don't even know if we haven't answered, but it's just one of those things that like you have to aspire, and visualize something before you can start to try and build it yourself.
And it's funny, by the way, listeners, viewers, Remington just talked about hyper growth and these startups and this dream. Go back and listen to this episode 4 of this season. We talked to Nelson Joyce and the anti-startup because that's not always the answer. So that was a good one. So all right, so if that's the culture that we talk about, and a lot of that is the perks on site. How do you figure out culture with this hybrid team that we now have, both distributed remote and also in-house?
Yeah, so we mentioned it. I think it was season 5. Fast forwarding into episode 5 of season 2. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about the fact that almost like two cultures have emerged. Mm-hmm. That was not by design. That happened by accident. But it's one of those things that, again, I don't mind two cultures as long as they're aligned and going in the same direction. I don't know if it's wrong. I don't know if it can be fixed. It's just something I've never come across myself. But the cultural thing, part of our thing is communication, right? Candor is one of our core values. Speaking up, talking about things like that. So the fact that like people have certain thoughts and opinions on one side versus others, even if they don't know that they conflict with each other, like that's some friction in culture. I think when we talk about like a distributed team or a hybrid team, there has to be compassion, right? People have to understand that other people have lives. Most people do. And I'm not saying necessarily for Impulse, but in general, like most people realize there's compassion on the other side of the line. But a lot of that has to come with like speaking your story. Like if you're having a bad day, say you're having a bad day so no one railroads you because they're like, what the heck is wrong with Dan today? Mm-hmm. Right? Be like, hey, I'm feeling off today. Mind not like razzing me with so many gift gabs?
I love the giffies.
And for the record, for the audience, we have a channel dedicated to just strictly GIFs and memes. That's the safe space so that we don't clutter up the rest of our lives in Slack. But sometimes they get pretty crazy. Someone will be like, "Ow, my elbow hurts," and then you'll get like 47 Giphies that people are just like, it's a Giphy war that people go by. But that's culture, right? Totally. They're joking around. But the balance of that, the inverse or the yin versus the yang, is making sure people say that they care about that. Like, oh man, I'm sorry. That sucks, right? So I think when there's that balance, everything's cool. But I think sometimes it's like, it's different personalities too. You know, it's kind of interesting how the same personality is pulled out differently in different areas.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because like that, you know, what you said, you know, somebody's having a bad day, man. You and I had that discussion just the other day. I mean, very, very honestly, we were talking like, how are you? I'm like, man, actually, I'm having really just a crappy day, and I just need to vent for a minute, you know. And I was frustrated with myself about something.
Sure.
I'm like, am I off base on this? And you were like, yeah, you're being sensitive. All right, cool. Thank you. Like that. And that was good. But that candor, that's the culture, you know, another part of the culture that I love about Impulse and how we do those things. So
yeah,
have that is awesome. So it's interesting to me too. Like we talk about some of the perks and things, and we kind of covered this back on that distributed team episode, but having a distributed team and having culture and having perks, it is different. How often do you and Rachel talk about the difference between that, the people out and the people in when it comes to like headquarters? Is it often enough still? Is it just occasionally because you feel like it's going pretty well? How does that work for owners?
So owners are plagued with the mindset that it could always be better. Doesn't mean that it sucks. Right.
That's fair.
So, you know, I've always operated on this. So are we operating 80% is actually acceptable and probably better than most others, right? So is the culture 80% of where we thought it would be? Or is the performance of this at 80% of where we thought it would be? In most cases, that's a great sentiment, in my opinion, because usually we're pushing pretty hard. You know, usually we're trying to go in certain areas, but I still obsess like crazy over that 20.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, we always talk about that stuff. It's funny. We've had a lot of conversations about the dual culture stuff, because I didn't even realize that it was a thing until it was a thing in episode 5.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of doing these. But you know, when we start talking about that, like there are some examples, like we've talked about historically too, like bringing in one person at a time. Right. So that's working really well. Not breaking up the momentum of the agency, but it's causing another area that starts to become a little bit more friction, because people don't get to know each other in a group setting, you know, other than once a year. Right. So it's like, so there's always this balance that I think that you're gonna dance, and it's trying to understand like how well can we optimize it, and is it even possible? You know, is it people or process? Almost every time it's people when it comes to culture, but how can we make the process make things smoother? So we obsess over that a lot. Like how can we adjust these things? We're talking about a different way in structuring benefits, for instance, and making it more flexible. Those all, I think, tie into culture, not directly like, oh, that's a culture item, I can check it, but tie into they really care about us. And that thought is what ties into the actual culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think culture needs to be a line item on a budget?
Your expense report, yes. Because it's not going to be something you're going to be able to go out and buy, but it's going to cost you money for camaraderie. Is that something that you'll be able to put a profit line next to? Not directly, but it should help. It should help overall. Like flying everyone in for a Christmas party does nothing for profits on the invoice, right? But what it does do is it does align people to know, like, and trust each other more, and start to get more motivated to help and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the thought process there.
All right. So let's talk about shipwrecks. I love getting into these kinds of things because so many of our guests have been transparent and authentic, and so have you. Yeah. What culture shipwrecks or shipwreck have you and Rachel experienced?
Sure. So the big one was the chrysalis effect, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail now. But you know, in general, when we start thinking about the shipwrecks, it's going back to this is what we want the outcome to be. Here's culture item A. Almost every time that we actually do it like that, that one specific item blows up in our face. Like the rest of the team probably has no idea, but it's like, that didn't work. So like there's a lot of those, but the most like glaring example is when we focus strictly culture as far as culture's sake. That was like we grew really fast. Like I'm talking 300% year over year, 3 years in a row. Things were just going, and culture was a line item on the list because we needed to have a good culture, right? And so we had all of these things, and we had people that were a part of it. And looking back, hindsight is always 20/20. Looking back, the problem is that there was no alignment in the direction of that. Like the core values we had were really principles of employment, which to me are like, this is how you don't get fired, not this is where we want to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when you don't have that aspirational direction for the company, or when you hit that goal that you put out and you don't reassert a new one, the culture and the people don't know where to go. And so what happened is we busted through our goals so heavy and so fast. Like my 10-year goal was to have an office like Apple. That was like my very materialistic view. Mm-hmm. And then in less than 3 years, we moved into an office that we didn't have like the custom Italian marble floors, and like the magic, the magic cabinets that came out of the walls. But like we had like a lot more of a quote unquote office than we did before. Like it was an old lawyer's office that we were in originally that had like drab burgundy and like, mahogany chairs that were like not what you would consider impulse creative.
Right.
And fast forward now, like you won't be able to find that kind of stuff. But all of that stuff that we did and that fast growth, like we were just like, woo, we're awesome. And we were, and we are. But when people got there, they were like, yeah, we're awesome. And then there wasn't, as an organization, like the vision to the next step. And so what it did is I feel like we're going, and then suddenly like it just scattered in all these different directions. And that's where those vectors really kind of come in. So the biggest shipwreck in general was we didn't have that aspirational direction. We had a couple people that weren't aligned on core values because we didn't have them, right? We had don't get fired principles. And so they paid attention to the don't get fired principles, and we checked those off as a list. And what resulted in is that person was like, you know what? I'm not sure where we're going. Maybe I should take all these employees with me to this next agency that has a destination in sight. Mm-hmm. I take ownership in that's really where a big shipwreck was from a membership point of view, but people still suck. Like if people are going to be negative like that, then, that's not necessarily something I own, but I fostered the culture that led to that problem.
Sure. I get it.
Yeah.
That's a good lesson too. Yeah. How about a big culture win for you? What's one point you've looked back and you're like, holy cow, this all came together perfectly?
Yeah. So it's funny. I probably don't say this enough to the team, but this year has been really amazing because I have stepped out of service delivery more than I ever have before. And I've also taken, I took a week off and nothing blew up. Right. And so as an owner, especially one that has been going through and hustling the way that I personally have been hustling, everyone's been hustling at the office, but specifically I haven't stopped. When I left and I came back and had space in my calendar because the last time was several years prior and everything did blow up. I came back and I was like, what do I do? Why am I needed? What's going on? And then I was like, hang on, this is absolutely awesome. Not as a selfish, wow, I'm not needed anymore point of view, but more of a holy crap, this is awesome. The team is literally jiving, the ball is rolling, and then you start to have the, oh crap, the ball is rolling and I have to get out of the way.
So is that the big lesson from that? You have to get out of the way?
Well, I have to get out of the way. I find anything that slows down at the office is usually my fault because I'm a bottleneck. But it's one of those things that like I'm incredibly proud that I'm proud, and how do I get out of this situation to not slow down the team, right? I was actually having a conversation with Jackie. I was like, I'm really excited to be at this point where the agency, and Rachel and I talk about this all the time, like the agency's moving to a point where we can't slow it down. Like just because someone's sick, like I've been sick the past 2 weeks, like just because I'm sick does not mean the agency's going to slow down for me.
Right.
Which is great, but also sucks because if the agency has to slow down for me because I can only do that, and there are a couple items that falls into, then that's can be scary. Rewind a couple years ago, if I got sick for a week, delivery gets slowed down for a week.
Yeah.
And clients are okay with it because we said that, hey, we're slowing down. But now there's a lot of payroll burning if I slow things down. So they can't. So it's just one of those things. So super proud of the team, super proud of like the momentum and the direction. And it's like one of those things that like each day, even though I'm obsessing about the 20, that 80% is killing it.
Love it, man. Great stuff.
Cool.
What's a navigational tool that helps you figure out culture or maintain culture or guide it, whatever you want to call it? What's one of your navigational tools?
So being socially aware, I think is one, but
how's that? What do you mean?
Socially aware of like your surroundings and because I don't put a label on this is what our culture is, it's easy to listen to try to understand what it is. And it changes. It's just like the stock market, right? Like there's like really good days and sometimes you're like, what the heck just happened? But you can't come in like the Kool-Aid man and try to change stuff because that's not going to help anything. It's really more of like the inspirational, aspirational, like this is kind of where I think we should think about guys. And it's one of the things I have to bring back. I had not my captain's log, but like the weekly compass that we were doing internally. And then I got busy. But when we start thinking about those navigational tools, I think it's top-down communication, an open door process or policy rather. But like if you have remote people, making sure that there's a door that they can open. So like 15-5 is that for us. And I had a very interesting conversation with an employee on the team, obviously. The other day was, I'm quiet in those. And I said to him, well, that's because that's a good thing if I'm quiet, because that means we agree with how you say you're doing, or we agree with the process of things. When I speak up, it's like I'll speak up or I'll give like a thumbs up in the 15-5s. And for the audience, I think we referenced it in episode 5, but
yeah, we did.
But 15-5 is like this weekly survey that goes out like on a scale of 1 to 5. How happy are you? If I expect it to be a 4, I'm not going to question why there's a 4. But if I think it's a 4 and then it comes in as a 1, or the inverse, I think it's a 2 and it comes in as a 5, like both of those are alarming because we're not aligned. That kind of stuff is amazing. And then one of my favorite features of 15-5, and it's been actually happening a lot today, is watching the praise from teammate to teammate. Like Dan, you did a bunch today. I think there was like 3 or 4 of them. Like, hey, so-and-so, thank you for this, blah, blah, blah. And like, so it goes back and forth. And so the whole team gets to see this praise. And I think that appreciation that you see is what we feel as a culture. So 15-5 has been huge for that. And then personally, as a leader, my bi-weekly walks are a way for me to put my finger on the pulse of the individuals, and I think ergo the culture as well.
Yeah, those are both good. I can see those coming into play often. So good navigational tools for people to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So I think one of our greatest navigational tools as well for culture is video. We talked about it on a previous episode. Video first, man, especially for a hybrid / distributed remote, whatever you want to call it, team. But even I think in-house, like video face to face, that is huge. And I don't feel removed from the team like people would think, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 2,000 miles away or whatever it is. So that's a big one for culture, especially remote culture. You can. Awesome. Great, man. This is great stuff. We could talk all day, but we'll make more episodes later about stuff.
Yeah.
But
so
I want to know.
I do have one thing that I haven't figured out.
Yeah.
Put this out to the audience, and this is my own self-awareness, making sure I listen to this in a couple of weeks. But the one thing I haven't figured out is, from a cultural perspective, how you continue to inspire people to provide feedback. And what I mean by that is sometimes, so as an owner or as a manager, you cannot give yeses to every bit of feedback. But just because it isn't a yes doesn't mean it's unfounded or unheard. This is an area where I'm in my journey of, it's not a no, it's actually a positive attribute, when people give feedback or people give insight. So when we're thinking about candor as a core value, if we talk to management about something that we don't like or everything else, I think as companies get larger, they procedurally have to move slower, right? And I think that they also have to consider more factors. Like, I'm 1/15 of the equation right now, where when it was Rachel and I, we could change policy tomorrow, right? Because it was just two of us. Yeah. But the understanding as an employee where your part is, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but understanding where your part is, and the fact that feedback can be heard but not acted on immediately at the same time. So I'm just trying to figure out how to embrace that. Maybe I just did. And kind of share that soundbite, because I think sometimes as leaders, we expect to be able to help people that way because we feel that we should be able to turn things around. And at the same time, as an organization, we have to respect the organization, that it can't just pivot and be a yes for everyone.
Sure.
I can only imagine if we had a unanimous decision about something for 15 people at a board. Like, thank God we don't have a board. The board is Rachel and me, but that's just one of those things. So, that's an area where I'd love to hear people's insights about how they handle that, but maybe it's just talking about it like I just did.
Yeah. Well, for listeners, I mean, if you have an insight, leave a comment, hit us up on social, hit Remington and Remington Beg on Twitter, something. Let us know what you found. So that's good, man. All right. So off topic, we're going to wrap it up with this last question. What are you consuming right now? Reading, listening, whatever.
Consuming. So I do this podcast roulette.
Yes. I love that.
Which is so much fun. And I've also been obsessing about Jay Shetty. I'm doing a lot of like emotional intelligence kind of consuming right now. So I kind of burnt myself out on this marketing stuff. Last year, I think I was listening to like 12 different marketing podcasts.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was just like drinking from a fire hose, but it was like, okay, I already know what this tastes like. And so I've been going really heavy into this whole, inspirational, emotional, intelligence kind of thing. And Jay Shetty's podcasts do not disappoint. And sometimes, actually, one of the first ones that I found, it was like completely like off the wall, nothing I would ever normally listen to, but parallel, right? Like, I got one soundbite out of that 1.5-hour episode, and I was like, this is gold. So yeah, look outside, and I'm a big fan right now, because I'm busy, of passive learning. So podcasts are where that's at for me. So consuming a lot of that type of content. And then Amy Porterfield too, because I'm also on this whole membership thing. So she's a rock star.
Yeah, her stuff is awesome. Absolutely.
Yeah. And she's always so inspirational and happy.
Yeah. And such great stuff. So my consumption right now is a book that I've been reading that's tough to get through because it's deep, but it's totally outside of anything we ever touch and anything we ever do. It's about slavery, and it's two journeys of freed slaves of how they escaped during the Civil War and stuff.
Wow.
It's their journey, and this guy wrote it, and then he shares their actual like handwritten accounts of their escape. It's just incredible. Like it's so, I never would have thought.
Perspective.
Yeah. It's so good. It's so good. We learn so much in school about the Civil War and stuff, but victors get to write the history, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's interesting to read someone who's been through it and what that was like. So I'm reading that right now. They Once Were Slaves, it's called. So just, I love getting outside of what I do. Like you, I listen to a ton of marketing podcasts. I read a ton of marketing books. My bookshelf is full of marketing, David Meerman, Guy Kawasaki, Scott Stratton, Jay Baer. But getting outside of that and changing perspective is so important. So that's what I'm reading right now.
Yeah, I love that because it roots us. It lets us take a second to have compassion and appreciation for where we are, how we got it, what we got going on.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of really good lessons in that stuff. And I living on the boat years ago, like that perspective, especially for history, is really interesting because like you talked about the victors write their history books. Well, over in the UK, they lost and they wrote a history book, right? Like, so it's like the perspectives of it. So I always like to try to find that other perspective. I think that's really cool that you're going that route.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, passive learning right now, I'm just sponging it up.
I get it. Awesome, man. Great discussion. We're slated next time to talk about interesting subject, how owning a business is like parenting.
Oh man.
And while that might give you a negative connotation, listeners at first would be like, what, people are just children? Like there's an interesting thing that you said that what sparked this. So listeners, check it out next time, because parenting, you can't force your kids to do anything, but you can guide them.
Yes.
So think about that. Tune in for next time for how owning a business is like parenting. Remington, it's been a pleasure, man.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening. If you like this episode, please share it. Post it, tweet it, gram it, email a friend. Give the gift of knowledge to someone you know that could benefit from it. And if you really loved it, please consider leaving a rating and written review on your podcast player of choice. And as always, go to wayfindinggrowth.com for resources and past episodes. Remember, we're here to help you navigate your business growth with strategic conversations and insights from experts in multiple industries. Thank you for listening to Wayfinding Growth.